We're going to discuss 5 important parts of a quantitative research. Quantitative research is quite fun, especially if you know what you want to do, and especially if your aim is to generalize the findings of this research. You need to be able to use the results and compare or predict a larger sample size. That is why we have a rigorous sampling and recruitment for quantitative research. First off is the philosophy. In quantitative research, the philosophy is positivism. Positivists believe that you can measure reality. You can use numbers to decide what works and what do not work. For example, you are trying to know the prevalence of depression. You can use numbers where people now tell you their depression symptoms, if they're experiencing some symptoms, to know if this person has depression or not. Is that not fascinating? Very interesting. You can do it for a large population. For example, students, you can get like 200 students that will feel their symptom. You can now say, oh, in the student population, depression is very high because 80% of people experience severe depression. Very interesting. So that's what positivists believe, that you can measure reality. You can objectify it. They believe that reality is objective, basically. Then they have this approach to research. It's called deductive. Deductive means is usually used when you're testing an hypothesis. If you're doing a quantitative research, it's good to have an hypothesis. We have the null hypothesis, we have the alternative hypothesis, where you can say, oh, the null hypothesis is saying there is no significant relationship between one or two variables, or it could be a dependent and an independent variable. That is a null hypothesis. Why an alternative hypothesis is still saying there is a relationship between. You can now go further and determine the effect size. Let me not bore you. If you want me to do another video, I'm always willing to do that. So just let me in the comment section and I can do a follow-up video and tag you with it. Another very important consideration in quantitative research is the recruitment. Unlike qualitative, where you use non-probability methods, in a quantitative research you need to use a probability method. We have the random sampling, we have the stratified sampling, we have the cluster sampling. You can read this more because the aim of a quantitative research is to generalize a result. So you need to choose a sample size or have a sample size that is comparable or it's a bit identical to the sample size. That means if you use if you have 1,000, the sample population is, let's say, 1,000, and then you're sampling 100 people, you can now generalize the findings to 1,000. There are also calculations you can do to determine the appropriate sample size based on your population. You can use G power to calculate it. Online, there are also several calculations that can really be easy to know the sample size that you can include that can generalize your findings. Strata sampling, you need to put the population into strata, and then for each strata you can now pick out a number of participants in the study. While cluster is almost the same thing. You have to segment your research to clusters. Another important consideration is data collection. One of the most common ways of collecting data in a quantitative research is questionnaire. That's like a survey, and you can use Likert scale. You can even use open-ended and closed-ended questions, but it's more common to use a closed-ended question so you can calculate. But for example, you can also use an open-ended question. For example, if you want to know the number of hours people sleep, for example, if you're doing a research that has to do with sleep quality or something like that, using an open-ended question, you can get the number of hours people sleep and you can do several calculations with that. So the most common way of collecting data is a questionnaire. Also want to consider data analysis. How are you going to analyze your data? You can use, there are two most common ways of data analysis in quantitative research. We have the descriptive method and we have inferential analysis. Descriptive is when you're collecting data, analyzing it based on like percentages, the mean, the standard deviation, the minimal, the median, the maximum, the range, the interquartile range, a lot of that. But if you're doing an inferential analysis, you want to look at correlation test, but you need to determine if your data is parametric or not parametric. For example, if your data is parametric, the correlation test you're doing is Pearson correlation test. But if it's non-parametric, you are likely going to be using Spearman rule correlation test. So this is very, very important. If you need me to do more, so this video does not look so big, just let me know in the comment section. I'll do a follow-up video. Then you need to inferential analysis. You have regression. There's a difference between correlation and regression. Correlation is when you're trying to know if there's a relationship between two variables. That is correlation. But for regression, you're trying to know if the independent variable can predict the dependent variable, you can also do follow-up calculations. There's a formula for regression which is pasted here, which can help you to calculate and know the predicting ability of the independent variable for the dependent variable. Another thing you need to consider if you're doing a quantitative research is validity and reliability of the data instruments. That's the question, yeah. There's a difference between validity and reliability. If you're trying to know the validity, what you're just trying to say is that the instruments can measure what you want it to measure. Let me use an example of depression, and you're using the PHQ-9, or let's say anxiety, and you're using the generalized anxiety disorder scale, which is the GAD-7. The 7 there means it has 7 items that people have to reply, like 7 questions that people have to respond to. You need to know if the questions can actually answer the aim of your research. That is why you check for validity. Why reliability is to check the consistency of the instrument over time. That means if this can measure depression today, in 2 months' time, is this still going to measure depression accurately? In quantitative study, you also need to consider the research design, because this varies. We have the cross-sectional research design, which is measuring an exposure and outcome at a single point. Then we have the cohorts, where you measure things in at different periods. We have the baseline. You can measure after 2 months. You can measure after years. It's a very long-term thing, so you need to consider if you have the time to actually do a cohort study. It's usually higher on the research hierarchy because they believe that you can measure causal relationships, in a cohort study. We also have RCTs, where you have to do a trial, clinical trial. You have to have an intervention group, a control group. So these are different research designs you can do when you're using a quantitative approach. So if you consider all this, I think you're in for a quality and enjoyable quantitative analysis. But it's always good to know about quantitative analysis very well, because it can be complex. Unlike qualitative, which deals with text basically, quantitative can be more complex. For data analysis, good tools to use software. You have the Excel, you have the SPSS, you have Stata. These are good data tools, softwares that you can use to foster your research. I hope this helps, and if you have any other question concerning quantitative text or anything, if you want me to do a sample of a Likert scale, anything, just let me know in the comment section, and I'll be willing to do a follow-up video.